The galaxy was old. Old enough to have watched species crawl from the mud of their home worlds, reach for the stars, and either flourish or burn in the reaching. It had seen empires built on the bones of weaker civilizations, had watched fleets darken entire star systems, had witnessed the slow, quiet death of cultures that had once believed themselves eternal. The galaxy had seen all of this, and it had grown indifferent to it. What it had never seen, in all its long and patient history, was anything quite like the humans. They arrived small, fragile in ways that made even the most modest species feel superior. Their technology was primitive, their ships slow, their weapons laughably underpowered by galactic standards. They were the kind of species that more powerful civilizations looked at and felt a warm, uncomplicated contempt for. The Kryll Empire, which had ruled the known galaxy for 300 years with the casual confidence of those who have never been seriously challenged, found them particularly amusing. The Kryll had enslaved 12 human colonies. They had taken human labor to build their stations, human resources to fuel their expansion, human lives to serve as examples of what resistance would cost. They did it openly. They did it without apology. They did it because nothing had ever suggested they should do otherwise. The humans had not fought back. They had not organized protests or sent fleets of angry warships. They had watched, quietly, with dark eyes that the Kryll never thought to study too closely. Admiral Vorkith had said it plainly at a high command briefing. They accept their fate. The room had agreed with comfortable laughter. But Alara had sent her message before her colony fell. A calm, unhurried message that said, "We are not weak. We are patient. We are watching. And we have a doctrine." The Kryll filed it away and forgot it. They would not forget it for much longer. The doctrine of total eradication was not born from anger. It was born from memory. Centuries before humanity reached the stars, it had nearly ended itself. Not in a single war, but in a slow, grinding series of conflicts where half measures had extended suffering far beyond what full resolve would have allowed. Peace treaties that held for decades before collapsing. Ceasefires that gave enemies time to rebuild. Mercy extended to those who had no intention of returning it. Humanity had studied its own history with the cold honesty of a species that had learned the hard way, and it had drawn a single uncomfortable conclusion. Some threats could not be contained. They could only be removed. The doctrine was not a weapon. It was a philosophy, a framework built into the deepest levels of human strategic thinking, dormant for generations, waiting for the conditions that would require it. Those conditions were specific. An existential threat, a species that had demonstrated, through action rather than intention, that it would not stop. The Kryll had been checking those conditions one enslaved colony at a time. What the Kryll did not know, could not have imagined from their position of comfortable dominance, was that every colony they had taken was a lesson being recorded. Every supply line they had exposed, every patrol route their ships had flown, every gap in their defensive perimeter had been quietly noted by people who appeared defeated, but were simply waiting. The silence of the humans had never been surrender. It had been study. Alara sat in the labor camp and watched the guards the way a cartographer watches unfamiliar terrain. She had already sent the warning. She felt no urgency now, only the calm patience of someone who knows exactly what is coming and understands that it cannot be stopped. It began without announcement. No declaration of war, no ultimatum, no dramatic broadcast across Kryll communication channels. One morning, a frontier garrison on the edge of Kryll space simply stopped responding. Command sent a verification ping. Nothing came back. They dispatched a scout vessel to investigate. The scout arrived at coordinates that should have held a fully staffed military installation, housing 40,000 personnel, 3 orbital defense platforms, and a dry dock capable of servicing a battle group. What the scout found was empty space. Not ruins. Not wreckage drifting in the dark. Empty space, clean and cold, as if the installation had never existed at all. The reports that followed came quickly, each one more disorienting than the last. A supply depot near the Kryll core worlds gone. A shipyard that had been producing vessels for 2 decades gone. A fleet staging area where 800 warships had been preparing for routine patrol gone. The Kryll High Command convened in emergency session, and for the first time in 3 centuries, the room felt something that had no comfortable name in their language. Vorkith received the transmission while his advisors were still arguing about sensor malfunctions. The screen cleared and Alara was there. She looked rested. She looked unhurried. She was standing on the bridge of a human vessel, and the stars behind her were calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She told him the doctrine was now in effect. She told him it would not stop. She told him it was not a weapon but a system, one that identified threats and removed them with the same quiet efficiency it had demonstrated already. She told him surrender, at this point, was no longer a door that opened from his side. Vorkith sat in silence long after the screen went dark. He was trying to remember the last time he had felt afraid. He could not. The counteroffensive was Vorkith's last act of certainty. He gathered every warship still under KRYL command, every vessel that had not yet vanished into that clean and terrible silence, and he pointed them at the human fleet. It was not strategy at that point. It was reflex. The KRYL had always responded to problems with overwhelming force, and overwhelming force had always worked. He told himself this as he watched the formation assemble on his tactical display. Hundreds of ships, moving in tight coordination, the finest military hardware 3 centuries of dominance had produced. The human fleet did not scatter. It did not raise shields or move into defensive formation. It simply held its position, patient and still, the way Alara had been patient and still in her labor camp, the way the humans had been patient and still through every indignity the KRYL had visited upon them. The KRYL ships crossed the engagement threshold. Then they were gone. Not one by one, not in groups, not with the drama of explosions or the chaos of electronic warfare. All of them, simultaneously, in a single moment, so clean it barely registered on the sensors. The tactical display updated itself and showed empty space where an entire fleet had been seconds before. Vorkith did not speak for a long time. He looked at that empty display and finally understood something that the humans had known about themselves for centuries. Mercy was not weakness. It was not timidity or lack of resolve. It was a choice made deliberately, renewed every generation, extended even when it was not deserved. The KRYL had received that mercy for years without recognizing it for what it was. They had mistaken restraint for inability. They had pushed and taken and laughed, and with each act they had been quietly, steadily exhausting something that had no bottom until suddenly it did. What came after mercy, Vorkith now understood, was not anger. It was not vengeance. It was simply the doctrine, inevitable, impersonal, and complete. The KRYL Empire did not fall the way empires were supposed to fall. There were no final battles, no heroic last stands, no burning capitals broadcast across the galactic network. It simply stopped functioning. In 3 weeks, every military asset it had possessed was gone, and without those assets, the machinery of dominance had nothing left to run on. Its admirals had no fleets to command. Its generals had no armies to deploy. Its high command, which had ruled with absolute confidence for 3 centuries, sat in rooms that felt suddenly very small and issued orders that no one could carry out. The galaxy watched all of this in a silence that was different from the silence of indifference. This was the silence of recalibration. Every species with a diplomatic corps, every empire with an intelligence network, every civilization that had quietly laughed at the humans alongside the KRYL was now looking at its own assumptions and finding them unreliable. Alara's final message to the KRYL survivors was transmitted without ceremony. She told them their people had not been killed. Their worlds had not been scorched. Only the machinery of harm had been removed, and what remained was theirs to rebuild as they chose. She told them the doctrine would continue to watch, not with malice, but with the patient attention of something that had already demonstrated what it was willing to do. It was not a threat, she said. Threats implied uncertainty. This was a guarantee. The KRYL wept in ways their language had rarely needed words for. They had learned, at enormous cost, that willingness was its own kind of power. The Veth Confederation's Institute for Interspecies Studies had produced landmark analyses of every major galactic conflict in recorded history. Its researchers were known for their rigor, their patience, and their reluctance to draw conclusions before the evidence demanded it. Thessa, a senior researcher who had spent 30 years studying the mechanics of warfare, spent 6 months studying the doctrine before she wrote a single word of her findings. What she found unsettled her in ways she had not anticipated. She had expected a weapon. She had expected to find, beneath the surface of what had happened to the KRYL, some devastating new technology that could be categorized, understood, and eventually countered. What she found instead was a system. Not a system of destruction, but a system of observation so thorough and analysis, so precise that threats were identified and neutralized before they could fully form. It did not fight wars. It made wars structurally impossible for anyone it had decided to prevent. She chose her words carefully when she published. She wrote that humanity had built the ultimate expression of a species that had studied its own capacity for violence and decided to redirect it entirely into prevention. Some colleagues called the paper brilliant. Others stopped returning her messages. The humans, reading her work, felt something complicated move through their public discourse. Pride, because she had understood. Unease, because understanding it clearly made it harder to look at without asking difficult questions. They had built the doctrine to protect themselves. That it could look, from the outside, indistinguishable from something far darker was a thought they carried quietly and did not often speak aloud. The delegations arrived within days of each other, ships from a dozen different empires queuing politely outside human space in a way that would have seemed absurd a month earlier. They came bearing the things that had always worked before. Trade agreements printed on ceremonial materials. Resource allocations calculated to impress. Offers of military alliance from powers that had not previously considered humanity worth the diplomatic effort. Ilara received each delegation with the same unhurried courtesy. She listened to their offers. She thanked them for making the journey. Then she told them, clearly and without performance, that humanity wanted none of it. No resources, no allegiances, no formal arrangements that would draw them into the complicated architecture of galactic politics. They wanted to be left alone. The doctrine existed to ensure that they would be. The terms were simple enough that no treaty was required. The delegations left confused in a way that was almost philosophical. They had prepared for negotiation and found nothing to negotiate with. Kryll came later, alone and without official standing, a former admiral who had survived the collapse of everything he had served. He walked through an ordinary human city for 3 days. He saw parks where children moved without fear, markets where no one looked over their shoulder, public spaces that had no visible security presence because none was felt to be necessary. He asked an elder, eventually, why they had built something so absolute. She told him they had built it because they had learned they could not afford to need it twice. He walked home through the gardens, and he understood. The doctrine did not rest. It had not been designed to rest. It moved through the data streams of the galaxy the way deep ocean currents move, invisibly and without pause, registering everything, evaluating everything, maintaining the continuous low-frequency attention of something that had already demonstrated the cost of being caught unprepared. It was not watching because it was suspicious. It was watching because watching was what had made the difference, and it had no intention of forgetting that. The galaxy changed around it slowly. Old rivalries that had fueled generations of conflict lost momentum, not because the species involved had grown wiser, but because certain calculations had shifted. The humans were not conquerors and had shown no interest in becoming one. But they were a boundary, and boundaries, once established with that kind of clarity, have a way of quietly reorganizing the space around them. A child asked her grandmother about it one evening, the way children ask about things that adults have stopped questioning. She wanted to know why something that had never threatened her still made other species lower their voices when they mentioned it. Her grandmother thought about it honestly before she answered. She said the doctrine was not feared because it was cruel. Cruelty could be anticipated, endured, eventually overcome. It was feared because it was consistent, because it was the living record of a promise humanity had made to itself in its darkest years, a promise that had turned out to be true. She said it could be wrong, and that the possibility deserved to be held carefully. But a galaxy without it meant a galaxy where the only limit on harm was exhaustion. That, she said, was the alternative they had already tried. Generations moved through the galaxy the way light moves through deep water, slowly, and with a quality that changed everything it touched without announcing itself. The wars that had once defined the relationships between species became historical curriculum, studied by young diplomats who had never known a galaxy that worked any other way. Trade routes that had previously been contested with fleets were now maintained by agreements renewed annually over shared tables. The Kryll, who had once extended their dominance through chains, now extended their influence through conversation. They had become, against all historical probability, careful listeners. Sora was one of them. Young, recently posted to her first diplomatic assignment, she had grown up with the stories the way all Kryll children grew up with them. The silence that had fallen over their military. The transmissions from Ilara. The 3 weeks that had ended 3 centuries of empire. She had processed those stories as history, and history had always felt like something that happened to other people in other times. Earth surprised her. She had prepared herself, professionally and emotionally, for something that felt like power. What she found instead was afternoon light falling through old trees, children moving through open parks, cities that had never thought to build walls because they had never needed to. She asked an elder about the absence of defenses, because the absence was so complete it felt like a statement. The elder told her the doctrine watched, so that walls did not have to exist. She asked if it could fail. The elder held the question honestly for a moment, then said they had built for that possibility too. The promise had been made. The promise would be kept. Word of the doctrine traveled in the way that genuinely unprecedented things travel, slowly at first, carried by the accounts of those who had witnessed its effects, then faster as the accounts accumulated into something that could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration. By the time expeditions from neighboring galaxies arrived to study it directly, the humans had been living with its presence for so long that they sometimes forgot how strange it appeared from the outside. The expeditions came with instruments and researchers, and the particular energy of civilizations that had identified something they wanted and had not yet been told they could not have it. They studied the doctrine's effects on the Kryll, on the political architecture of the galaxy, on the behavioral patterns of species that had reorganized themselves around a boundary they could not see but could feel with considerable clarity. They wrote detailed reports. Then they asked for the source. Alara's descendant, who carried her grandmother's name and something of her stillness, explained that there was no source to hand over. The doctrine was not a mechanism. It was an understanding, developed across generations of a species that had looked honestly at its own history and drawn conclusions that were difficult to live with and impossible to ignore. You could not copy an understanding. You could only develop one. When the frustration hardened into threat, the response was calm in a way that was more unsettling than anger would have been. The doctrine had already been paying attention. Boundaries, the expeditions were learning, did not require walls to be completely real. Cale had been 6 years old when his grandmother told him about the activation. He remembered the way she described Alara's transmission, the calm in her voice, the stars visible behind her through the ship's viewport. He had grown up carrying that image without fully understanding why it stayed with him, and it was only when he began his formal research into the doctrine's origins that he understood he had been carrying a question all along. The answer he found was not what he had expected. He had assumed, the way most people assumed, that the doctrine had been built by strategists, by military planners working from threat assessments and resource calculations. What he found instead was a small group of survivors. People who had lived through the worst that human beings had done to each other, who had stood in the aftermath and decided that the only honest response was to build something that made repetition structurally impossible. He wrote carefully because the subject required it. He argued that the doctrine was not a weapon in any meaningful sense of the word. It was an ethical framework, assembled by people who had understood that punishment arrived too late by definition, and that the only intervention worth building was one that operated before harm became harm. The response was divided, which he had anticipated. He accepted the criticism alongside the praise with the same measured acknowledgement, because he had said in the paper itself that the doctrine was not perfect. It was honest. In a galaxy that had spent centuries lying to itself about the nature of power, honesty remained the rarest and most durable thing anyone had managed to build. The principles spread the way good ideas spread when the conditions are right, not through mandate or pressure, but through the gradual recognition that they describe something true. Species that had built their security on the threat of retaliation began, quietly and without much public announcement, to invest instead in systems of early observation. Conflict prevention offices appeared in governmental structures that had previously housed only military planning departments. The language that diplomats used to describe their work shifted in ways that would have seemed optimistic to the point of naivety a century earlier. The humans watched this with the particular satisfaction of people who had never wanted credit for something they had hoped others would eventually figure out on their own. They had not built the doctrine to export it. They had built it to survive. That its principles turned out to be portable, that other species could look at what it had cost the Kryll and draw their own conclusions, was something they received with quiet gratitude. A young Veth asked an elder why they had allowed the principles to travel when they had refused to share the mechanism. The elder said the mechanism was never the point. The point was the understanding underneath it, the recognition that peace was not a condition that arrived and then maintained itself. It required the same continuous attention that any living thing required. She said they would never stop watching. The Veth asked if that was a burden. She thought about it genuinely before she answered. She said it was the price, and that the price was worth it, because she had read enough history to know exactly what the alternative looked like. 1,000 years is long enough for the memory of pain to become the texture of wisdom. The species that had once organized themselves around the threat of each other had grown into something more complicated and more interesting, a galaxy that still had tensions and disagreements and moments of dangerous pride, but that had learned, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to work through them before they became something the doctrine needed to address. Wars had not disappeared entirely, but they had become rare enough that young historians studied them the way geologists study ancient upheavals, as evidence of forces that had once shaped everything and now mostly held still. Sora had grown up wanting to understand the thing that had made this possible. She had read the accounts of Alara, the analyses of Thessa, the philosophical papers of the Kale, who had written about preventive ethics centuries before her own birth. She had followed the thread of it across generations until she found herself standing outside a facility on a small moon that looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular. Inside was a single room. Screens arranged in quiet rows, data moving through them in patterns she could not yet read, and people, from more species than she had expected, sitting with the particular stillness of those who have learned to pay very close attention. A KRYL observer, who had served longer than she had been alive, answered her question before she finished asking it. He said someone had to watch, and that he had seen enough history to understand what accumulated in the spaces where no one did. Sora sat down beside him. She had not planned to stay. She did not leave. Kale had come to the network with the energy of someone who had spent years preparing for something important and was finally being allowed to begin. He had studied conflict theory, diplomatic history, the psychological literature on de-escalation. He had arrived expecting the work to feel like the culmination of that preparation. What he found instead was that preparation had only given him the vocabulary. The work itself was something you learned only by doing it, slowly, with more patience than he had initially understood he would need to develop. Observation, he discovered, was not the passive thing the word suggested. It was the most demanding kind of attention, the kind that required you to hold what you were seeing without immediately interpreting it, to let patterns develop at their own pace rather than the pace your expectations preferred. He watched a situation between two species that had a long history of grievance accumulate toward what looked, for several tense weeks, like a threshold the doctrine might need to address. Then it didn't. The species found their way back from the edge through channels that had been built, quietly and without fanfare, by the same kind of patient work Kale was learning to do. He reported the de-escalation with relief that surprised him with its intensity. A senior observer told him that the moments when the doctrine did not act were not failures of nerve. They were the point. The entire architecture of observation existed so that species would have the space to choose something better on their own. Action was the last resort, the long silence before it was the whole work. The edges of the known universe were not empty. They were full of species in the earlier stages of the journey that the older civilizations had already made, some of them still organizing themselves around dominance, some of them reaching tentatively towards something more durable, most of them somewhere complicated in between. The doctrine's network had learned, across centuries of expansion, that introduction required care. You could not hand a newly contacted species a philosophy and expect it to land cleanly. You could only offer it and answer the questions honestly and wait. The being who asked the hardest question was young by the standards of its species, which meant it was several hundred years old, and it carried the specific skepticism of someone who had seen enough of the universe to distrust easy assurances. It wanted to know why trust was the appropriate response to a system it had not watched develop, maintained by species it did not yet know. The observer, a human who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped finding the question surprising, said they had earned it the only way trust could be earned, through time and consistency and the accumulation of choices that matched the stated values. The doctrine had not conquered. It had not extracted. It had only done what it said it would do, for long enough that the record spoke for itself. The being sat with that for a while. Then it said it would not trust blindly, but that it was willing to watch and see. That, the observer said, was exactly right. The network had grown into something that none of its original architects would have fully recognized, though they would have recognized the shape of the intention underneath it. 1,000 species contributed observers now. They brought with them 1,000 different ways of reading silence, 1,000 different instincts about when tension was dissipating and when it was merely resting, 1,000 different cultural understandings of what patience looked like and what it cost. The doctrine had become, without anyone deciding this was what it would become, a kind of collective conscience. Not a ruler, not an authority that imposed. A presence that remembered, on behalf of everyone, what had been possible when no one was watching. A child on a colony world asked her mother what it was, because children ask the questions that adults have learned to carry quietly. Her mother had been an observer for 20 years. She thought about how to answer in a way that was honest without being heavy, and she said it was a promise. She said it was the shape that a very old decision had taken across a very long time. She said it meant watching even when watching was difficult, and acting even when acting was costly, and carrying something that did not get lighter but that you learned, eventually, to carry without being bent by it. The child asked if she could do that one day. Her mother said that was entirely up to her, but that the promise would be there, patient as it had always been, whenever she was ready to take her place in it. Thousands of years is a span that makes empires look like weather. The civilizations that had defined the galaxy when the doctrine was first activated had changed so completely that their earlier forms survived only in historical archives and the patient memories of species that lived long enough to carry multiple centuries inside a single lifetime. The Kryll, who had once built their identity around conquest, had spent so many generations rebuilding that identity around something else that their children's children had to study recordings to understand what their ancestors had been. The humans who had once been the galaxy's quiet victims had become something harder to categorize, not leaders, not rulers, but the kind of presence that a room reorganizes itself around without anyone deciding to do so. The galaxy was not perfect. Sora, who had spent her career as a historian rather than an observer, was careful to say so in every chapter of the book she spent 12 years writing. There were still disagreements that hardened into crises. There was still pain that moved through communities in ways that took generations to work through. What had changed was not the presence of difficulty, but the way difficulty was held. Conflict had become something that happened within a framework, rather than something that dismantled frameworks entirely. Her final chapter argued that the doctrine had not been the cause of this. It had been the condition that made it possible. It had asked, through its existence and its history, what the galaxy was willing to protect. And the galaxy, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable backsliding along the way, had found its answer. The book's last line traveled further than she expected it to. No one assigned Kryll to the network. He applied, the way people applied for things they had decided mattered to them, and he waded through the evaluation process with the particular impatience of someone who has already made up their mind and is waiting for the formality to catch up. He had grown up in a family where the doctrine was discussed the way some families discussed faith, not as an institution to be analyzed from the outside, but as something you either understood from the inside or didn't yet understand at all. What he had not grown up understanding was how demanding the inside was. Observation required a quality of attention that his training had described accurately, but that description had not fully prepared him for. You watched not for the dramatic moments but for the small ones, the conversations that shifted tone in ways that suggested something accumulating underneath, the policy decisions that seemed administrative until you placed them in sequence with other decisions and saw the direction they were building toward. Most of what he watched resolved without the doctrine needing to do anything. He was learning to understand that this was not nothing. This was the work. When the situation between two neighboring species began to develop the particular texture of something that might not resolve on its own, the doctrine's response was not a warning or a demonstration of capability. It sent observers. They traveled to both worlds, and they sat with people, and they listened with the quality of attention that Kryll was only beginning to understand how to offer. The conflict found its way to resolution. A senior Kryll observer told him afterward that listening, done with full presence and without an agenda, was the most powerful intervention the network had ever learned to make. The universe was larger than the galaxy had once imagined, and the network had been learning this incrementally for centuries, each new contact expanding the map in ways that required the observers to examine their own assumptions before they could be useful to anyone they were meeting for the first time. You could not approach a newly contacted civilization carrying the weight of your own history as if it were universal. You had to arrive lighter than that, carrying only the offer and the patience to let it be considered honestly. The being who challenged the Veth observer most directly had the specific quality of someone who had been lied to by systems before and had developed a well-reasoned policy of skepticism as a result. It wanted to know why the record of the doctrine, however long and however consistent, should override the fundamental uncertainty of trusting something you had not watched develop from the beginning. The observer did not argue against the skepticism. She said it was the appropriate response, and that the network would not have wanted blind acceptance. She said what she was offering was not certainty, but an invitation to watch alongside them, to examine the record directly rather than accepting her account of it, to build whatever degree of trust the evidence earned over time, rather than the degree she was asking for now. The being said that was a different offer than it had expected. It said it could work with that. It joined the network not as a believer, but as an evaluator, which the observer said was exactly the right way to begin. The network had become something that the word network no longer quite described. It was closer to a nervous system, distributed across a universe that was still expanding outward in every direction, carrying information and attention, and the accumulated wisdom of species that had learned, at varying costs and across varying timescales, that the alternative to watching was always worse than the watching itself. 1,000 galaxies contributed observers now. They brought with them ways of understanding silence and tension, and the particular quality of calm that preceded resolution versus the particular quality of calm that preceded escalation, distinctions that only became legible after years of paying attention to the difference. A child on a colony world in a galaxy so distant that its light had not yet reached the place where the doctrine was first activated asked her mother what the universe's conscience was, because she had heard the phrase and wanted to know what it meant. Her mother had been an observer for longer than her daughter had been alive, and she had learned that the best answers to the largest questions were usually the simplest ones. She said it was a promise. She said it was what happened when enough beings decided that the worst did not have to happen and were willing to do the continuous, unglamorous, necessary work of making sure it didn't. Her daughter asked if that work ever ended. Her mother said no. Her daughter asked if that was sad. Her mother thought about it honestly and said it was the opposite of sad. It was the whole point. There are stories that end and stories that become something else, something that stops being a narrative and starts being a condition of the world, present in the background of every moment without needing to announce itself. The doctrine had crossed that threshold so long ago that no living being could remember the crossing. It was simply there, the way gravity was there, the way the light from distant stars was there, fundamental and quiet and easy to forget until you thought about what its absence would mean. The gardens had spread. What had begun on a single world as a deliberate choice, a statement about what humanity valued and how it chose to spend the peace it had earned, had become a kind of common language across species that had never shared a spoken tongue. Gardens meant something now. They meant the same thing everywhere. A child was born on a world that her grandparents had known as a place of conflict. She grew up knowing it only as a place where things grew. She learned the history the way all children learned it, in pieces, at the pace that understanding allows, and she assembled it slowly into something that made sense of the world she had inherited. On her 10th birthday, she visited the observation room and sat in the quiet presence of screens that had been watching longer than her civilization had existed. She did not have a speech prepared. She whispered 2 words into the silence and felt, in the stillness that followed, something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately and never quite managing to. She went home and planted a seed. She watered it the next morning, and the morning after that. She grew into the work the way trees grow into the shape of the wind, gradually, and through a process that looked from the outside like simple persistence, but felt from the inside like continuous learning. The network accepted her application with the same unhurried process it applied to everyone, and she took her place among the observers with the particular quality of presence that distinguished people who were doing something they had chosen from people who were doing something they had settled for. The lesson she carried, the one she returned to when the work was difficult, was not one she had read in any of the historical accounts. It had come to her slowly, assembled from years of watching how conflicts developed and how they resolved, and it was this: the wars had not been the primary thing. They had been the result of something smaller and older, a fear that accumulated in the spaces between species that did not know each other well enough to understand that the other's strength was not automatically a threat to their own. Vigilance, she had learned, was not watching for enemies. It was watching until strangers became familiar enough that the category of enemy stopped being the first one your instincts reached for. She sat with a young Veth who was struggling with exactly this, and she offered nothing except her presence and the particular quality of silence that communicates, without words, that you are not going anywhere. She had learned this from someone who had done it for her once. The Veth steadied. She stayed until they did. She lived long enough to see things she had not expected to see. Species that had been newly contacted when she began her work were now contributing senior observers of their own. Conflicts that had seemed intractable in her early years had found resolutions that no one had predicted from within them. The gardens that had been planted on 100 worlds had grown into ecosystems that had not been designed but had emerged, the way all the most important things emerged, from the accumulation of small and patient decisions made by people who would not live to see the full result. She did not take credit for any of it. Credit was a kind of claiming, and she had learned early that the work belonged to no one and everyone in the same proportion. On the last morning she was well enough to spend time outdoors. She asked her family for one thing. They had expected something large. What she asked for was a seed, planted anywhere nearby, for no reason except that she wanted to know it was there. They planted it outside her window. She watched it from her bed in the days that followed, and she found that watching a seed was not so different from the watching she had done all her life. You paid attention. You trusted the process. You did not rush the outcome. The tree that grew from it was still young when she died, and the garden that eventually surrounded it did not know her name, but it grew in the direction of the light she had pointed it toward. Stories do not end. This is one of the things that sounds like a comfort and turns out, on examination, to be simply true. The events end. The people move through and are gone. But the shape that their choices made in the world persists, the way the shape of water persists in stone long after the water has moved on. The wars had become the kind of history that required effort to remember, not because it had been forgotten, but because the world it described had grown so distant from the current one that it required active imagination to reconstruct. The children who were born now grew up in a universe that watched over itself, not because it had been told to, not because it feared the consequences of stopping, but because enough generations had now lived inside the understanding that this was what care looked like when it was practiced at the largest possible scale. A child on a distant world would hear the story eventually. She would hear about the humans and the Kryll and the silence that had fallen over a military empire in 3 weeks. She would hear about Alara and the message that had been ignored and the doctrine that had never been a weapon. She would hear about the gardens and the observers and the long patient work of a universe learning to watch over itself. She would plant a seed. She would watch it. Somewhere in a garden that no one had named, a flower was already blooming, unhurried and complete, and it needed nothing to be other than what it was.